Imagine being born with everything to be a legend. The son of Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, and Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome. Caesarion, the heir to two worlds, carried a grandiose destiny. But what was supposed to be a life of glory turned into a tragedy without equal. Forgotten, erased, crushed by political ambitions, he lost not only the throne, but the very chance to be remembered. Have you ever felt like no matter how much potential you had, you were ignored, forgotten, or left behind? This is the essence of Caesarion's story. But what really happened to the heir who held the world in his hands? Today you'll discover how power, betrayal, and fear wrote one of the darkest chapters in ancient history. So stay with me, because this story will touch your heart and open your eyes to the invisible sacrifices that power demands. Imagine being born destined to be one of the most fascinating characters in history. This was the case with Caesarion, son of Cleopatra VII, the Queen of Egypt, and Julius Caesar, the powerful Roman general. He came into the world surrounded by mysteries, expectations, and disputes. Cleopatra wasted no time in declaring to the world that her son was special. It said that he was not only the heir of two great powers, but also a descendant of the gods. To her, Caesarion was the key to something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. For Egypt, Caesarion was practically a little living god. Cleopatra presented him as the new Horus, a sacred figure who symbolized the link between divine and human power. She saw herself as the goddess Isis, further strengthening the image that her son was special, predestined to great deeds. Now think about the impact of this. A boy who represented the hope of uniting two worlds so different, but equally powerful. He was a promise of something that seemed unattainable, peace and balance between the West and the East. However, in Rome, things were not quite like that. Julius Caesar never officially recognized Caesarion as his son. Of course, everyone knew about his relationship with Cleopatra, but the Roman elite saw it as something shameful and dangerous. After all, for them, Caesarion was not a legitimate heir, but a threat. A great threat, by the way, especially for Octavio, who had his own ambitions for power. Imagine being a child whose mere birth struck fear among the most powerful men in Rome. With the death of Julius Caesar, the siege tightened even more. Cleopatra allied herself with Mark Antony, another great name in Rome, in an attempt to protect Caesarion and secure his future as co-regent of Egypt. But this alliance ended up inflaming tempers in Rome even more. Octavian did not see Caesarion as a promise of union, but as an obstacle to his own rise. He knew that as long as Caesarion was alive, there would always be a risk to his power. And for men like Octavio, risks were eliminated without mercy. Have you ever felt that the stories you know about Rome are always the same, without the real details, emotions, and strategies that defined the greatest empire in history? With that in mind, I created the 10 battles that shaped the empire. This book gets straight to the point. Clear, moving, and never-before-seen explanations of how legendary leaders turned battles into historic milestones. You no longer need to get lost in confusing reports. Click on the pinned comment and download now the 10 battles that shaped the Roman Empire. But beware, it is for a limited time. Transform the way you see history and discover what has always been missing in the narratives you thought you knew. Now imagine how fascinating it is to think how such a young boy could carry so much meaning. For Egypt, he was the hope of a new era. For Rome, a potential danger. In the midst of it all, Caesarion was just a child surrounded by a world of intrigue and ambition. Cleopatra did everything to protect him, but Octavian's rise to power made this almost impossible. When Octavian finally defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony, he had no mercy. Caesarion, the boy who was born to be king, was considered too great a threat to be left alive. His death was a devastating blow, both to his mother and to those who believed in the dream of togetherness that he represented. Caesarion's story is a reminder of how power can be both a gift and a curse. He was the symbol of a dream of unity, of greatness, and of transformation. But it was also the embodiment of fears and ambitions that shaped the fate of entire empires. In the midst of all this, the question remains, what does it really mean to be special? For Caesarion, being special was not enough to save him. Even so, his story continues to be told as a powerful warning that, in the game for power, not even those with divine blood are safe. Before proceeding, I saw here that you forgot to subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss all the content about Rome that we will always be bringing. Cleopatra knew exactly what she wanted and how to fight for it. When Caesarion was born, She saw in him a chance to ensure that Egypt would not be swallowed up by the power of Rome. Imagine the scene, a resolute mother holding her son and proclaiming to the world that he was the heir to both Egypt and Rome's most famous leader, Julius Caesar. For her, he was not just a boy. He was a future pharaoh and the perfect symbolism to unite two worlds. From an early age, Cleopatra placed Caesarion in a prominent position. She made him co-ruler and went on to shape the image of him as a true son of the gods. Not only that, but she spread the idea that he was also the legitimate son of Julius Caesar, something that stirred the nerves of Rome. In Egypt, this worked perfectly. Caesarion was seen as a small god, predestined to lead. But in Rome, it was a different story. The Romans did not buy into this idea. For them, Caesarion was a problem, not a solution. His existence was seen as a direct affront to Octavian, the man who wanted to consolidate his own power as Caesar's successor. Imagine the tension. On one side, a queen trying to protect her son's legacy. On the other, a future emperor determined to eliminate any threat. Cleopatra knew she was treading on dangerous ground, but she was strong-willed. To protect Egypt, she needed Caesarion to be recognized as the rightful heir. The queen also knew how to use wedding rings to her advantage. When he joined Mark Antony, the strategy became clear: to strengthen Egypt and secure Caesarion's future. Together, they proclaimed the boy as King of Kings. It was a title full of meaning and challenge. Cleopatra was basically telling Rome that Egypt would not only survive, but thrive under her son. For Octavio, this was too provocative. He knew that allowing Caesarion to grow and grow stronger meant a huge risk to his own authority. The big problem for Cleopatra was that her ambition also left her vulnerable. While she was building the image of Caesarion as a divine leader, she was also creating a giant target on his back. Rome did not accept the idea of a boy with Egyptian and Roman blood rising to power. For them, this was not just a matter of inheritance, but of maintaining control over the empire. Cleopatra, however, never backed down. She saw in her son the only chance to keep Egypt relevant. The relationship between Cleopatra and Octavian was like a game of chess. Each movement was calculated. Cleopatra bet everything on Caesarion, but Octavian was determined to destroy any trace of what he stood for. For Egypt, Caesarion was a hope. To Rome, he was a danger. And it was exactly this contrast that put everyone on alert. In the end, Octavio won. Cleopatra was unable to protect Caesarion or save Egypt from being absorbed by Rome. The ambition that guided her throughout her life ended up also being the reason for her downfall. But one thing is certain: his story and that of Caesarion continue to be remembered, not as simple defeats, but as examples of daring, courage, and the tireless struggle for what one believes in. Cleopatra may have lost, but her determination to secure her son's future still resonates as one of the most defining passages in ancient history. It is impossible not to admire the courage of a mother who dared to challenge the greatest empire of her time. Tell me here in the comments if you think that the Caesarion section would be different if he were more protected. I want to know your opinion. When Julius Caesar was assassinated, Rome was plunged into a chaos of power struggles. Picture the scene. Rival factions fighting for control as a new threat emerged. In the midst of this maelstrom was Caesarion, Cleopatra's young son, whom she insisted was Caesar's rightful heir. Now, think about the impact of this. For Octavian, who would later be known as Augustus, this was like a thorn in the flesh. Caesarion was an uncomfortable shadow, symbolizing a possible union between Rome and Egypt, something Octavian would never allow. Cleopatra knew how to use this tension to her advantage. She didn't just want Caesarion to be recognized as pharaoh. She wanted him to be accepted as the son of Julius Caesar. For Egypt, this idea was a marvel. Caesarion was seen as a divine gift, a promise of strong leadership. But in Rome, it was a different story. Octavio saw the boy as a direct threat to his plan to consolidate power. And let's face it, Octavio was the type of man who left no threats unresolved. Things got even more complicated when Mark Antony entered the equation. Not only did he support Cleopatra, but he also recognized Caesarion as Caesar's true heir. It was like pouring gasoline on the fire. So Octavian used this as ammunition, spreading the idea that Mark Antony was betraying Rome by allying himself with a foreign queen. The propaganda was fierce, and Caesarion eventually became the center of this conflict. On one side, he was a symbol of hope. On the other, a figure that needed to be eliminated. The population of Rome was bombarded with stories that reinforced this fear. The situation exploded once and for all with the Battle of Actium. When Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, it was clear that the end was near for Egypt, and for Caesarion, things got even bleaker. Octavio knew that as long as the boy was alive, there would be a possibility of revolts or unexpected alliances. It was not a question of justice or piety, it was political practice, pure and simple. Thus, the order was given. Caesarion should be eliminated. Now, think about the symbolism of this. Caesarion was not just a boy trying to find his place in the world. He represented an idea. The idea that Rome was not invincible, that different cultures could coexist. But Octavio had other plans. He wanted a centralized, strong, and undivided empire. For him, Caesarion was the past that needed to be erased. This decision was a milestone in consolidating his vision of absolute power. When Caesarion was executed, the world lost not only a young heir, but also a possibility of something different. Cleopatra tried to protect her son, but the forces against her were immense. In the end, the challenge that Caesarion posed to Octavio was not only political, it was a dispute of narratives, of visions of the future. And Octavio, with his ability to manipulate opinions, won. Caesarion never had the chance to show what could be. But his story makes us think about how power can shape the destiny of a person, and even an empire. It was a hope that never came true, a reminder that in the world of politics, there is not always room for dreams. Perhaps, if the circumstances had been different, history would have taken a different turn. But as we know, power rarely gives way to uncertainties. Imagine a confrontation that would change the fate of two great empires. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC was just that. On one side, Cleopatra and Mark Antony, fighting with everything they had to defend Egypt and their own survival. On the other, Octavian, determined to consolidate his power and ensure that Rome was the sole power in the Mediterranean. This was not just naval combat, it was a contest that would define who would control the future. Cleopatra knew that the situation was desperate. If they lost, there would be no second chances. She and Marco Antonio were betting all the chips. On the other side, Octavio knew that winning meant much more than destroying two opponents. It was about dismantling the alliance that threatened his own rise to power. Egypt, with its wealth and strategic position, was a prize he was not willing to let slip away. When the dust settled on Actium, the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony was devastating. Mark Antony, overcome with shame and despair, took his own life. Cleopatra, however, had another concern. More than her own safety, she feared for the future of her son, Caesarion. To her, he was the hope of continuity of her lineage and Egypt's independence. But Octavio, implacable as ever, had no intention of showing mercy. Cleopatra tried to negotiate. Using his intelligence and charisma, he argued that Caesarion could be useful to Rome, perhaps as a submissive leader. But Octavio was no fool. He knew that as long as the boy was alive, there would be a constant risk of revolts or alliances that would endanger his power. Caesarion was not just a boy, he was the son of Julius Caesar, a name that still carried enormous weight among the Romans. Octavio could not afford to let this threat exist. When the order to execute Caesarion was given, there was no hesitation. It was a cold but calculated act. Octavio needed to ensure that there were no potential rivals in his control. Cleopatra, realizing that all her attempts had failed, decided to end her own life. Her death was as dramatic as her life. She chose a venomous serpent, refusing to be displayed as a trophy in a Roman parade. And don't forget to pick up your digital book 10 Battles That Shaped the Roman Empire. It's important that you get it right now before the units run out. With the death of Cleopatra and Caesarion, Egypt ceased to be an independent kingdom. It became a Roman province, a milestone in the early Roman Empire under Octavian, now called Augustus. It was the end of an era in which Egypt had been a world power, but also the beginning of a new order led by Rome. This battle and its aftermath were not just about military victories. They showed how brutal power can be, and how the fate of individuals is often sacrificed in the name of greater ambitions. Caesarion, a young man who never had the chance to prove his worth, became a symbol of what could have been. And so, history went on, with Rome at the helm and Egypt reduced to a reminder of its former glory. What remained were memories of a time of struggle, dreams, and the inevitable clash between two worlds that could never fully coexist. When Cleopatra died, Caesarion's fate hung by a thread. Imagine being a teenager, the son of a powerful queen and one of the most famous men in history, and suddenly losing everything. He was vulnerable, alone, and in mortal danger. Some loyal advisors, trying to protect the last remnant of the Ptolemaic dynasty, suggested that he flee. The idea was to take him to India, where he could find safety, support, and maybe even raise an army to one day fight for his throne. Escape seemed his only hope. With few resources and many enemies on his trail, Caesarion left Egypt. Every step was risky. His origins could not be hidden, and anyone who recognized him could hand him over to Octavian's forces. The tension was palpable. He was the last obstacle to Rome consolidating its absolute power over Egypt. But before he could cross safe land, he was intercepted. Octavian's troops, relentless, captured the young heir. The capture of Caesarion was more than a military act. It was a calculated move to end any chance of resistance. For Octavio, Caesarion represented a living threat. As long as he was around, there would always be those who questioned Octavio's right to power. After all, Caesarion was the declared son of Julius Caesar, and that had a gigantic weight. Octavian could not allow this shadow to hover over his ascension. The end was swift and merciless. Caesarion was executed by direct order of Octavio. There was no judgment, there was no mercy. His death was not only the end of a life, but also the end of an era. With it, the last hope that Egypt could maintain its independence or resist Roman domination disappeared. Caesarion's elimination was not only an act of power, but a clear warning that Rome would not tolerate any opponent. Think about what that means. Caesarion was a boy who never had the chance to fight for what could have been his. He carried within him the dreams of generations, but ended up crushed by the weight of a power struggle much greater than him. Octavio's decision to eliminate him was brutal but strategic. It was the way to ensure that there would be no rivals or questions about who was in charge in Rome and the Mediterranean. With Caesarion's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to an end. Egypt, which had been one of the greatest powers of the ancient world, was reduced to a province under Roman control. For Octavio, it was a complete victory. For Egypt, an irreparable tragedy. The brilliance that once made Egypt a symbol of wealth and power has been replaced by foreign submission and control. Caesarion was not only a victim of the brutal politics of his time, it became a symbol of what could have been, a reminder of how ruthless power can be. His story is not just about loss, but about how individual ambitions can change the fate of entire nations. Egypt would never be the same, and Rome was on to become the empire that would dominate the ancient world, marking a new era of conquest and domination. Caesarion was just a teenager, but he carried a gigantic weight. The son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, he wasn't just a young man trying to weather the storms of history, he was a symbol of something much bigger. And Octavian, the man who sought to consolidate absolute control of Rome, knew that he could not let this threat hang over his power. It was ruthless. The order was given. Caesarion had to disappear. His justification was as cold as it was direct. 2 Caesars or one more. Think about it. Caesarion represented much more than a name or a title. It symbolized the last spark of hope for a sovereign Egypt, the connection between 2 of the greatest powers of the time. But for Octavio, he was a potential danger, a shadow that could undermine his government. Rome had no room for rivals, not even for young people who did not yet fully understand the role they played. His execution was swift and cruel, as if erasing a life was as simple as erasing a mark in the sand. There was no trial, there was no clemency. For Octavio, it was a strategic decision, necessary to prevent Julius Caesar's legacy from being used against him. But for Egypt, it was the end of a dream. With Caesarion, the last hope of resisting Roman domination died. It was more than the loss of an individual. It was the collapse of an entire dynasty. Now think about the irony. Caesarion was proclaimed Prince of the Gods, but ended up reduced to a footnote in history. He never had the chance to be the leader he could have been. His life was shaped by forces far greater than himself, forces that gave no room for a young man to find his place in the world. He was just a boy, but he represented dreams and ambitions that went far beyond his years. With Caesarion's death, Egypt ceased to be an independent power. It became just another Roman province, one piece of the Rome-dominated Mediterranean puzzle. Octavian, now Augustus, was consolidating his power as the first Roman emperor. For him, eliminating Caesarion was a political victory, a calculated move to ensure that there would be no contestants. But this decision also marked the end of an era, the definitive farewell to Egypt as a major world power. Caesarion was not just a victim of his time. He was the last gasp of a dynasty, that for generations had ruled one of the greatest civilizations in history. His story reminds us of how brutal power can be, how ambitions can redraw maps and silence voices. Egypt would never be the same, and Rome, with its new order, would emerge as the greatest power of the ancient world. Thus, Caesarion's death was more than the end of a life. It was the end of an entire chapter of humanity. The impact of this decision would echo for centuries as a milestone of how absolute power can change the course of history. Caesarion's story did not end with his death. In fact, what came after was a calculated attempt to erase their existence from the world. Octavio, now called Augusto, knew that just eliminating the young man was not enough. More was needed. He needed to make sure that no one remembered Caesarion as Julius Caesar's heir or as a threat to his authority. Thus, a real conspiracy was set in place to erase all traces of his memory. The Roman propaganda machine was relentless. Statues depicting Caesarion were destroyed, and documents mentioning his name were rewritten or simply erased. It was as if he had never existed. Caesarion, who in life was hailed as Prince of the Gods, became just a ghost in a system that rewrote history to favor the victors. The goal was clear: to make Augustus the sole legitimate heir of Julius Caesar, and to ensure that there was no shadow of doubt about his power. And it didn't stop there. Caesarion's mother, Cleopatra, was also the target of a fierce campaign. Augusto spared no effort to turn her into a villain. According to Roman propaganda, she was a cunning manipulator who used her beauty to bewitch men like Caesar and Mark Antony. Caesarion, in this context, was portrayed as a fruit of this manipulation, a usurper who had no place in the new world that Rome was building. Think of the irony. Caesarion, which represented an almost divine union between Rome and Egypt, was deliberately made a footnote in history. He who could have been remembered as a great leader was buried under layers of propaganda and oblivion. The erasure of his memory was so effective that for centuries his existence was restricted to indirect and fragmentary accounts. Caesarion, which was supposed to be a symbol of hope, became an example of how power is able to shape the past. This erasure was not just a matter of erasing records. It was a demonstration of how power manipulates narratives. Augustus wanted to be seen as the savior of Rome, the man who brought order to chaos. For this, any memory of Caesarion as the heir of Julius Caesar had to disappear. The young man was turned into a ghost, and his story into a legend buried under the conveniences of power. The strategy was as brutal as it was effective, ensuring that only Augustus's version prevailed. Today, looking back, the story of Caesarion makes us reflect. What happens when the powerful decide who deserves to be remembered and who should be forgotten? History is not only made by the victors, but also by the silenced. Caesarion was more than a victim. He was an example of how absolute power can reshape the past and the future. His absence speaks as much as his presence once did. The erasure of Caesarion is a reminder that even forgetting can be a powerful form of control. The consequences of this echo to this day, showing how narratives can be altered to serve the interests of those who triumph. Caesarion is one of those figures who, even though almost erased from history, continue to arouse fascination. He is not only a name lost in ancient records, but a powerful symbol of the struggle between two of the greatest civilizations of antiquity, Rome and Egypt. Their short life, full of interrupted promises, shows the high price that the children of political ambitions pay. The son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, Caesarion was born surrounded by gigantic expectations. He was seen as a bridge between Roman power and the wealth and greatness of Egypt. The union between his parents suggested the possibility of a shared future between two powers that shaped the ancient world. However, its very existence aroused both hopes and fears. To Octavian, who would become Augustus, Caesarion was a potential danger, an heir who could shake his position. The decision to eliminate him was cold and calculated, part of a larger plan to consolidate Rome's control and end any shadow of doubt about his authority. What makes Caesarion so fascinating is that, despite all the effort to erase him from the official history, he was not completely forgotten. His name has survived in legends and narratives that have spanned the centuries, often portraying him as the son of the gods. He carries the weight of being a young man who symbolized two incredible cultures, but who was tragically crushed by the relentless forces of Roman politics. He is a figure that mixes reality and mythology, representing what could have been a different future for two warring civilizations. Modern historians see in his tragedy an important warning. It shows how power struggles not only destroy kingdoms, but also human lives. Caesarion was not just a prince. He was a young man who never had the chance to live fully. His life was shaped by the ambitions of others, and his fate was sealed long before he could choose his own path. He is a clear example of the high cost of being at the center of political disputes, where the most vulnerable are often the first to fall. In popular culture, Caesarion often appears as a figure shrouded in mystery, the heir who could have changed the fate of the ancient world had he survived. It is a reflection of the tensions between Rome and Egypt and the choices that shaped history. His story makes us wonder, what if he had lived? What impact could it have had on the course of history? This questioning fuels both speculation and artistic and literary interpretations about his legacy. More than a historical figure, Caesarion is a reminder of how ruthless power can be. He is proof that even when the world tries to forget, certain memories continue to echo. His story is a reflection on the cost of power struggles, a cost that often falls on those who least deserve it. Although almost erased, Caesarion stands as a symbol of all that was lost in the battles for control of empires. His legacy, although fragmented, continues to inspire reflection. It reminds us of how narratives are shaped by the victors and how the erased voices can still find a way to survive. Caesarion was not only an heir, he was an unfulfilled promise, a symbol of how history is full of what-ifs. His memory invites us to reflect not only on the past, but also on how power continues to influence our present and our future. Caesarion, the son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, had what it takes to be a living legend. He was born with the weight of two civilizations on his back, Rome and Egypt, but his fate was sealed before he could even fight for it. From being a prince of the gods, he was reduced to oblivion, crushed by the ambitions of those who desired absolute power. Caesarion became a painful example of how, in politics, even the youngest and most innocent pay the price of disputes for control. His name has almost disappeared from history, but he has never ceased to be a reminder of what could have been, a forgotten heir whose short life was marked by what he represented: hope for some, threat for others. The tragedy of Caesarion is not just about a young prince. It is a reminder of how cruel power can be, erasing lives, dreams, and stories in the name of a future that benefits the few. And remember, whenever you want to know how Rome became the largest empire in antiquity, just go to the pinned comment and get your digital book, The 10 Battles That Shaped the Roman Empire. Get it right now because the units are limited. And do you think that Caesarion would have changed the course of history if he had survived? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video to keep following stories like this. See you next time.